to highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. Well, good morning, everyone. Why don't you stand? It's a good Sunday to be here. My voice might cave out in the middle of this. And then Rachel will come in here and take my mic. I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Man's empty praise and treasures of fame are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. Father, thank you for meeting us right where we are. Thank you that you know everything that is going on. You've got it all under control. There's nothing better than you. You can turn anything into anything you want. You can use anything in our lives and turn it into good for your glory. So we ask that we hand those things to you right now. What are we hanging on to? God, what have I had an attitude about this week? Father, that's yours. And I'll probably take it back in an hour, but for now you can have it. Thank you, Father, for giving me another chance and another chance and another chance, and loving me and delighting in me at the same time. In Jesus' name.
All right, good morning. This is not COVID voice, this is coaching voice. So we got third and then flew to Lumsden to watch, or from Lumsden to Cairnport to watch Zach, and lost a little bit more of the voice in a close game there. So that was a lot of fun. So welcome here. We've been looking at the various ways that at the communion table, what happened at the cross. And there's images that Christ uses to describe what happened at the cross. And we looked at him as the substitute. We looked at how he defeated evil. This morning we see them as the healer. And the prophecy of this goes back to Hosea 6. I'm going to start in chapter 5. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his sores, where did they turn? Well, then Ephraim turned to Assyria and sent to the great king for help. But he is not able to cure you. He is not able to heal your sores. Then chapter 6. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. And then Hosea goes directly to the resurrection of Jesus. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us that we may live in his presence. From Luke 4. He went to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." When we think about it, a resurrected body from the dead is the ultimate mark of healing. To go from the worst of brokenness, which is death, to the ultimate of life, which is resurrected life. And so on the cross, one of the images of the cross that he has for us is that he heals us. This is relationally with God, relationally with people, and physically in our bodies. And so as we take communion this morning, it is to celebrate a God who heals, and who heals even if it seems like the end has come in death. There is a healer that comes after that, and it's just a door, not a wall. So let's join together in communion this morning. There we go. Lord, I thank you so much for your willingness to die for us. And somehow, and this I don't really understand how it works, somehow death leads to healing. And I thank you for introducing that paradox to us. And though we may not understand it, it is true. And so today we celebrate, and we thank you so much for your work on the cross and your resurrection for us. In your name, amen. Yes, you'll notice that the setup this morning is very different, and this is probably the best morning for me to have coaching voice, because I won't be doing as much talking this morning. So looking forward to my partners up here. A few announcements before we get going. We're not going to be doing children's feature this morning. We wanted to give this panel time as much time and space as possible. So even with Gwen, I just said, I don't know how many songs we're going to do toward the end. We'll wait and see. And so I had originally said 5 minutes for the panel, but I know that's just to kind of say, like, it's okay, like I don't want to make too big a deal, and then they ran with it more than what I'd hoped, but more than, and so we're going to be more than 5 minutes each. So just want to thank you for your support at the Soup and Bun lunch last week. Really appreciate that. Don't have a number for you this morning, or unless, do you want one, Caitlin? Or no? Okay. No, okay, so we'll get one for you, but just want to thank you so much for that. SOAR's coming up on the 17th, and Wingmen will be Tuesday at Trinity Safety in Saskatoon. And just wanted to remind you as well, because of as we kind of transition and change and adapt, that we realized that our Sunday school, our service time to Sunday school was just too rushed. In our desire to be efficient, we were losing community. And so we want to, there'll be a delay of 25 minutes, 30 minutes between, just give me a little less, I'm feeding back here, Dave. Thank you. Just wanted to give space for that. So Sunday school will be starting at 11:10. So don't rush out, even with parents with kids. Like, you don't have to take them down right away. It just we can just chill for a little while and have a coffee at the back and just do community here and not be rushed. Any other announcements that we need to make note of this morning? All right. So we're going to start in Job 34. And in Job 34, Elihu is trying to make and further his point that God intervenes to support the thesis that suffering equals wickedness. This law, reap sow kind of law of the universe. And so in Job 34:10, he starts this way. Listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong. He repays everyone for what they've done. He brings on them what their conduct deserves. There's that reap, sow, wickedness, suffering thing. It is unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. So then he introduces it that way, and then he turns his conversation to rulers and governors. And he asks a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question assumes an answer. And it's interesting, we're talking more about this next week, but I'm finding that there's a lot of rhetorical questions in Job that I don't agree with the answer that they assume. And this is one of them. So he says, can someone who hates justice govern? God does not pervert justice. Would God allow somebody who hates justice to govern? It wouldn't seem that way, because that would go against God's sense of justice. That would be actually blessing or promoting somebody who's wicked to allow them to govern. So he assumes there is no way that God would allow a wicked person to govern. And he picks this idea up in verse 24. And he's talking about these godless pagan governors. He says, without inquiry, he shatters the mighty and sets up others in their place. Because he takes note of their deeds, he overthrows them in the night, and they are crushed. He punishes them for their wickedness, where everyone can see them, because they turned from following him and had no regard for any of his ways. What were some of their governing principles? Verse 28. They caused the cry of the poor to come before him, so that he heard the cry of the needy. But if he remains silent, who can condemn him? If he hides his face, who can see him? Yet he is over individual and nation alike, to keep the godless from ruling, from laying snares for the people. So we see in this rhetorical question that God, if he, in his justice, keeps the godless from ruling. Now, I think that we can agree that that's not right. that Elihu's assumptions and that his rhetorical question, assuming the answer is no, is incorrect, is false. Because there's lots of examples of the godless, the wicked governing. They do hate justice, and they still get to govern. So how does this work? And we'll in about, I think, 3 weeks or a month from now, we'll go into how David responded to King Saul when Saul was wicked. How in current examples with Martin Luther King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, how they interacted with governments who were doing wicked things. And so we'll go combination of Old Testament and current day to look at how do we respond to this. But as I was going through this, I asked myself, if godless kings and wicked kings are governing, how do we live under them? And I think it's important to go through this question as we've moved to a kind of a post-Christian, post-Judeo-Christian environment. How do we live in the new reality? How do we bring the kingdom of God into the current kingdom of earth? So as I started to think about this question, I thought about Daniel. And from his teens all the way to his senior days, he was an advisor to the king, to pagan kings. How did he do this? Where was he when Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were battling against and didn't bow down to the king? We see there's no mention of Daniel. Was he on a road trip? Was he on what was he doing? Was he in a different province? We don't know. It kind of goes against our belief of him to think that he would be one of the ones who bowed down and kind of abandoned his friends. Were there times when he had to hold his nose against some of the values and the decisions the king was making? And then as I explored this, I began to realize he's not the only one who is in this position. There are at least 4 Jews who were the primary first minister to foreign kings, advising kings who had different values, who worshiped a different God. So Joseph, Esther, Nehemiah, and Daniel. And that's how we'll sit here just for my panel. We'll go Joseph, Esther, Nehemiah, and then Daniel here. So as I thought about these 4 characters, I thought about 4 other characters that would fit with these characters, and asked them if they would join in a panel discussion with me. And like I think I said last week, within 5 minutes of me sending a text out, they all said yes. Little did they know what they were getting into. Hey, Logan. So we managed to actually make it today. We thought we might actually have 2 of them on Zoom today, but we're all here. When did your flight get in, Elliot? Friday night? So we're all good. And so I'm going to ask Elliot, McKinley, Logan, and Darren to come up and join me on stage. You each have a mic. Come on up here, guys. And McKinley. So as we're going along, I'm going to, I got some questions that they knew about, but as I'm listening, I might have some other ones for you. I actually have one already. So, We're going to, as we do this, we're going to try and go in the same order. So last week, Elliot, Logan and Darren appointed you first. And what's that? So as we go through this, we're going to walk through their questions, and as we do this too, when we do go into Sunday school, we're not going to have this panel up here during our Sunday school time. But if you have questions and stuff, write them down. We'll process through some of this in our Sunday school time, in our adult Sunday school time following this. But just to introduce things, my voice is going to do, I'm going to do a teenage. It happens at least once a weekend. I don't think I did it once. Did it happen to me No, it didn't happen, sorry, this weekend. I get teenage voice. So, can I get each of you to tell us who your character is and what their position is or was in the king that they served under? So we'll go in the same order: Elliot, McKinley, Logan, and then Darren.
All right. Brief introduction to Joseph. His name means "May God add." He's the first son born to Jacob and Rachel.
I'm going to pause you there, Elliot. Yep. You guys can actually take your masks off if you want to. Yep. So, sorry, Elliot.
Okay. I'll start over then.
Yep.
Joseph's name means "may he," that means God add. He's the first son born to Jacob and his wife Rachel. Had several occupations in his life. He was a shepherd, he was a slave, and eventually an influential ruler in Egypt. And he's best known for becoming Jacob's favorite son, stirring murderous hatred in his brothers, becoming a faithful slave to an Egyptian master, interpreting dreams as God gave him, and eventually becoming second in command to Pharaoh, and eventually God using that to save his famine-stricken family in a greater story.
Awesome. McKinley.
Esther was an orphan Jewish woman living in Persia, and then she was chosen to be the queen by King Xerxes.
Awesome. Thank you. Logan. Dave, can we just leave all these mics on all time and not? Okay, if we can. No, actually, you need to press. That's more of my fault than yours. Right there. There you go.
Okay. Nehemiah was a Jew in exile in Babylon. He was the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes. He was a friend of the king, and he's most famously known for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem.
Okay.
So I had Daniel. He was also a Jew in exile. He was likely taken in his teens and was probably there through the whole exile, 70 years. So because of that, he served under 4 different kings: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, and Cyrus the Persian. Basically, for his role, he was the chief prefect. He was kind of in charge of all the magicians, which is funny how God puts one of his people in charge of these people that are looking to other gods to try to be all creative and smart. And Daniel, with God's help, just kind of one-ups them time and time again.
So it almost creates a problem right there by default. Okay, sounds good. And we get a part of this, like this, and this is why I wanted to have this conversation, is built into Daniel's job description is this conflict right away between gods and listening. And so awesome. Okay. So the question we're wrestling with today is how do these characters serve under foreign kings that have different values and a different God? And the Bible doesn't really give us a direct answer. It just gives us a story. And so I asked them, I said, it's okay if you do some speculation in this. Like, use your imagination a little bit, but try to come up with how would each person's nature and character and a story which illustrates their nature and character. And assume that we've never heard any of the stories before. Go ahead, Elliot.
Okay. So I started reading backwards into Jacob's story before Joseph is born. And what you find is that there's a lot of untrustworthiness, maybe, in a way. Jacob and Laban, his father-in-law, have dealings that always seem to be one-upping the other, or there's a bit of a side thing going on that you're not necessarily aware of. And reading forward, there's dealings with Joseph's brothers in different respects that they're always seem to be working an angle one way or another. And so you come to Joseph, and somewhere along the line, and it doesn't tell us this, but seems to have come to know the Lord at a fairly young age, and that has meant something for him, and he acting accordingly. And it starts with his father, so he becomes this favorite of his father, and he's sent to go and check on his brothers. Was it just a friendly checkup to see how things are going, or is Jacob wondering about his sons pulling a side gig because he used to do that kind of thing?
Yep.
I was reading that where he was initially sent to go and check on them at Shechem was a fairly long ways away. It may have been up to 60 miles away from home, so it's not just a, come back that afternoon kind of thing. So he's trustworthy in that, and that pattern, regardless of the circumstances that puts him in, either with Potiphar or the jailer, eventually with Pharaoh. He's a pretty careful manager that way, and trusting in the Lord.
So he seemed, if I'm listening to you, and this is why I wanted to do this, because there's things that are picked up along the way here that I would never have, and this is why I like the dialogue kind of doing things too. So oftentimes we as kids see things that we don't like in our parents and say, I am never going to do that, except for McKinley, because your dad's perfect, right? Yeah, right, we'll go with that. And it seems like this deceptive gene stopped with Joseph. Mm-hmm. Like he was not like that, was he? No. And actually, when he was interacting with, if he had been like that, do you think that he would have been trusted by Potiphar and the others in his kind of positions of influence?
I don't think so, in a way that if you're someone like Potiphar and you're in charge of a lot of things, you need people around you, and you can't just pick anybody, because they're standing in your place, and you have to have no shadow of a doubt that you're going to have a pretty good idea how they're going to act in any given circumstance. You can't predict what they're all going to be, so you don't have to be always side managing, make sure this or make sure that. You can actually leave them alone and trust them to do what they are, to act in your path.
And not to, I like your phrase there, working an angle. And there probably was, there's no politicians today who like working angles. And he probably was very aware of those working angles against trying to undermine him. And to have somebody like Joseph who was different probably was very unique.
I like that word unique, because just reading around the other stories, people like Joseph would have been very few and far between. So if you were someone in a position, a person like Joseph would be very highly sought after.
And I suspect as we go through things here, we're going to hear that over and over again. McKinley, tell me about Esther's nature and character, and there's a story that illustrates that.
I think Esther, she kind of has two kind of different parts to her character. On one hand, she's really gentle and passive and like what would have been expected for a woman and a queen in her time. But then at the other hand, she has like a really strong resolve and determination inside of her. I saw this like the whole like beginning of the book when Queen Vashti is, I don't know, taken out of her position, and when Esther's chosen, she like follows the rules. She does as she told. She has the beauty treatments. She's like just like a perfect little queen. And then Mordecai basically kind of in chapter 4 says, if you don't step up and save the Jews, like someone else is gonna, and you might die. Like you gotta get up here. And so then she kind of switches and she goes, well, if I die, I die. And she goes and sees the king and does the banquets. But even as she's doing her banquets, as she's meeting with I forget his name. Haman. Yeah, Haman is right.
Yep.
Haman and the king, she is like, when she's telling them, like, please save the Jews, she doesn't go like, hey, king, save the Jews. She's very gentle about it. It's like, if you wanna, if you could, I'd really like it if you could not kill my people. And so that just kind of, like the back and forth is a lot with her. I noticed it's gentle and serene and what's expected, and then like underneath though she's got this like determination that she's gonna do what she has to do to save her people.
So what did you read what happened to Vashti? How was she like demoted? Am I doing the feedback there? Is it mine or who's there, Dave? Sorry. Okay. So what happened to Vashti?
Well, Vashti was maybe more, she probably, I would imagine, got sick of being the gentle, serene queen person and was kind of like, stop telling me what to do. And she then was removed of her title. It's never says explicitly what the king asked her to do that made her say, no, I'm not doing that, other than just come out in front of the banquet. But
There seemed to be more to it than that.
Yeah, that's how I've always read it. But yeah, so she has this, like what Vashti has is inside Esther. She just doesn't express it nearly the same way. She's maybe a little bit smarter about how she expresses it than Vashti was, which works out well for her.
But it does give a little bit of hesitancy to Esther, knowing like Vashti's kind of this elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, some of the things I read said that likely part of the reason why Esther was so good and like good in the beginning part was because she knew what had just happened to Vashti, and there was like this in the back of her mind, oh yeah, can't do too much because of what just happened.
Yeah. Awesome. Logan.
So with Nehemiah, there's a lot of similarities between Nehemiah and Esther. And kind of with what McKinley was saying, one word I would add to this gentleness is respect. I find with all these characters that they were very respectful to their pagan leaders. They didn't, their door was open to them as much as the king's doors was open to these characters. A couple of words I use to describe Nehemiah is humble and discreet. And the reason I use the word discreet is when he was going to Jerusalem to kind of scout the city, and he saw the city had been burnt and the walls were taken down and stuff like that, he didn't say right away what his plan was. He kind of kept it to himself. He wanted people to kind of believe or get alongside him. He wanted to kind of, I guess, sell his character a little bit, get people kind of on board with him before he overwhelmed them with this plan to rebuild the city. So it's kind of this discreet is the word I use, because he's going there with a plan, but he's not telling people what his plan is. He trusted in God fully. He prayed a lot. Any confrontation that he would have from the other governors in the area and stuff, he would always kind of pray first to kind of figure out how to deal with them. And even when Artaxerxes asked him why he was so sad, he prayed first before he responded to the king. Kind of give me the right words to say to this king so I can carry out your plan, kind of a thing. And yet at the same time, with his own people, he was confrontational. So, there were Jewish leaders there that were charging interest to the people that they were lending money to, and these people were helping Nehemiah build the walls, and he was confrontational with them right away, challenging them, why are you charging interest to people who are trying to help our cause? So I kind of found, like with what McKinley was saying about Esther, the same kind of thing with Nehemiah. He was gentle and respectful towards people who were non-Jewish or non-believers, and yet to his own people he would challenge them on, is what you're doing part of God's plan?
When he was doing stuff, I think it's interesting that you picked up on the selling of his character to the people. Like, he didn't pull the king card with authority. Am I right on that? So when he went over to do that, his authority was based on his own character rather than, like, he was kind of holding this king card in the back pocket and didn't use it unless he had to.
Yeah, so like there's a really good example in that he had 150 people eating at his table, and it was all from his own money. It wasn't from the people. Like, he was sent there with resources from King Artaxerxes, but he would not make a burden on his people to look after him and his group of people or whatever, right? He was
Which speaks to his character.
Yeah.
Awesome. Darren.
So when I look at Daniel, I see someone who has kind of that next level of righteousness and faithfulness. He was faithful to God. He knew the law of Moses backwards, forwards, and sideways. And throughout his reign under 4 different kings, he was consistent, strong moral compass, faithful. The Bible really gives us zero dirt on Daniel, which is pretty crazy when you think of, like, Abraham, Noah, King David, all these people that you can think of, okay, he's got this guy's got this guy's got this, and then Daniel, it's just like, yeah, no, he just was consistent. In exile, mind you, in charge of the magicians, lots of reason that he could have went. Yeah, anyway. So looking at stories in chapter 1, along with his character, I think his ability is really important. And in chapter 1, it talks about how God gave him wisdom. God blessed him with learning. God gave him good looks. He was from a royal family, which made him part of why he was taken into exile, maybe as like a high-profile hostage or whatever. But certainly, through chapter 1, we see that God has set Daniel into a position where he's definitely going to get picked by the king. And that way he can execute God's plan that God has set out for him. And then another one to show is his nature and character. Kind of the classic Daniel story is Daniel in the lion's den. So you've got these magicians that are under him that are pretty jealous of him, and also kind of confused why he's so much better than everybody else. They don't understand. They basically say he has the abilities of a god. They can't understand how any human can do this stuff. And so as they look for dirt on him, the only thing is his faithfulness to God. That's it. So they trick the king into making that against the law. That's how they end up throwing him into the lion's den. And then as I was looking into this, something that I hadn't really thought about, he was probably like in his 80s when they threw him into the lion's den.
Yeah.
I don't know, when I read my kid's little children's Bible, he looks like he was about 30. But it changes things when you got this old, frail man that you're throwing into the lion's den. And it says, like, Daniel knew that this law had been signed, and after the law is signed, he goes and prays. That's the first thing he does. So just fears God, number one, faithful to his role after that.
I'm going to, you mentioned something, I'm actually going to reverse the order on this one. It was one of the questions that I had thought of was, and Logan and I talked a bit about this last week, how do they get in their position? Because you talked about this a little, you kind of referenced it, and I'd like us to kind of go backwards on this is, like, they shouldn't have been in this position. Realistically, none of them, they were all Jews in pagan spaces. So how did they get into that position? So start us off, Darren.
Yeah, so in chapter 1, it talks about when he was taken into exile. And so part of why he was taken was he was from the royal family and he was good looking. So that's kind of step 1 to make it past the first stage of you can stick around, you're useful. And then as he's doing his learning, there was probably 3 years where he was kind of getting immersed in Babylonian learning and world culture, and God gave him wisdom, and it says Daniel and his friends were 10 times smarter than everybody else. So again, God gave him ability, and Daniel used it to make himself useful and to get put into this position. And even in chapter 1, it talks about how the eunuchs are kind of looking after these guys, and they have this special diet that they're going to give them to kind of make them extra healthy and extra good for the king. And Daniel knows that this food from the king would make him ceremonially unclean, according to the Torah, to the law of Moses. And so it'd be very easy to say, hey, I'll take the steak and potatoes. But he says, no, I'm going to stick to what God has called me to do. I'm going to stay clean. And even as the eunuch says, like, this is going to get all of us in trouble if you're looking unhealthy after this. God's got it handled, and him and his buddies look the best after that little trial period, and God sustains them and, again, just puts them into or to have a chance to go in front of the king and be in a position that he really had no business being in. And
we in that, I guess, we see that moral character right from the beginning with Daniel.
Totally, yeah. He, even when there's an easy path and a path that's maybe more short-term better for him, he doesn't just go to what's quick and easy. He sticks to what he knows God has called him to do.
Okay, so before we get to the others, so how do you think he lasted? So you can speculate a little bit on this one. Like, so there's got to be times, right, with this guy of strong moral character is put in a position where he has to make choices that, like, he does not agree with. So how do you think that he lasted 70 years with 4 kings?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I was looking at Daniel's kind of special ability is interpreting dreams.
Yep.
And as I look at that part of what he did, it blows me away how he gets this bad interpretation or negative interpretation, and he just gives it to the king, pulls no punches. This is what's going to happen. And the king thanks him and gives him a gold robe and all these chains, or gold and coins or whatever, even if Daniel maybe refuses the reward. But somehow he has this ability to just give bad news, and the kings are happy with it, but probably only because time and time again he's been correct.
Right.
As the people underneath him are upset with him and jealous of him, it's maybe in spite of how much they want to get rid of him, he's always right. So you got to keep him around.
So God gave him a very unique gift, which it may have actually been the kings holding their nose as much as Daniel, that he proved himself had such credibility. And this goes a bit to what you were saying too, Elliot, with Joseph, was that being not deceit. He was so different than everybody else that they kept him around.
He must have just been too valuable, even if sometimes it was contradicting what these kings wanted to hear or what they thought it should be.
And the gift of having a pleasant tongue to give bad news and have it be accepted.
And to not really editorialize anything. He just said, this is what God told me. This is how it is.
No
period.
fluff. Sweet. Logan, so how did Artaxerxes, how did Nehemiah get to his place?
So mine's pretty well all assumption, because we don't really know how he became the cupbearer. All it says in chapter 1 is that he was the cupbearer. So the assumption that Tony and I were talking about last week was that, Artaxerxes came after Xerxes, and Xerxes had Esther, and that's kind of where there maybe look or the attitude towards the Jewish people would have changed. And maybe Nehemiah was a standout in that, and maybe, Xerxes told Artaxerxes that, these people have something special about them, or there are some in there that are very wise. They would have looked at it from a very different point of view. They wouldn't have known, or they would have known that God was behind what they were doing. Like there's wisdom there. Anyhow, so the assumption is that somewhere along the line he's picked as one of the kind of most trusted people of that group, and so he becomes the cupbearer. What I think, the assumption I made just when I was first glancing at this was that I think that Nehemiah was one of the advisors to the king that wouldn't be, there wouldn't be an advantages to his life or a disadvantage depending on what the king decided, because he's the cupbearer. He's the most trusted, person in the kingdom, because Artaxerxes trusts his life with Nehemiah every single day. And so I'm thinking that the king would have known that Nehemiah had a very unbiased attitude towards decisions needed to be made, or towards things, and so the king would have very much appreciated what he had to say. He would have taken it, quite seriously, because there wouldn't be any side deals or whatever going on with what he had to say.
McKinley, how did Esther get into her position?
Well, she was orphaned, and then that meant she was living with Mordecai in Susa, in the capital city. And so that set her up nicely to then get chosen to be a part of the harem, to go and then get chosen to be the queen. And then it also talks specifically about her beauty, and how when she went to go see the king after her months of beauty treatments, he was so blown away that he just had to give her the crown. So she was just strikingly beautiful.
And as you look at these two, one of the things that I was thinking of Nehemiah, kind of the term standing on the shoulders of others, and really Esther and Mordecai were so unique and made such an impression that almost by default Nehemiah was able to stand on their shoulders. And how it goes the opposite too, right? That if they were rotten, right, then there's nothing for you to stand on. Like there's no credibility. And how even as we do things, right, we don't know who's going to stand on our shoulders and come behind us as we interact with our culture, right? And that will our kids be able to stand on our shoulders of credibility and more character and other things? Elliot, how did Joseph get there?
It's quite a circuitous route that he gets there. There's a lot of off-ramps for Joseph that he didn't, it's not like he's taken directly to the king. He's born in a different country. He's tried to, his brothers tried to kill him. He's sold into slavery. None of these have any, they're not in the sphere of influence yet of Pharaoh knowing about you kind of thing. But after becomes a slave, and he serves well, and he's put in charge of all of Potiphar's house. Again, there's this off-ramp down where he's in prison because of a false accusation that he was willing to go with rather than go along with the temptation. Then he's put in charge of all the jail, and he helps to Pharaoh. There's the first, connections to Pharaoh here, and he helps interpret dreams with the cupbearer and the baker. And then they forget about him again, and another 2 years goes by. And only when, none of the magicians could help Pharaoh with his dreams does someone finally remember about him, and a call is made to him to come to see Pharaoh. And I think it's really interesting that when he does come, it talks about the verses preceding say that he shaves, and I guess Egyptians would have been clean-shaven people, except it says when they were like in mourning or something. But for a Jewish person, the beard was important, and so it's a pretty big sign of respect that after all this, that he was, wherever that came from was a result of it. And, he doesn't just come in all raggedy from jail. He gets cleaned up and gets presentable. And
I want to pick up that a second. You'd made a comment, I think, 2 weeks ago in Sunday school about the pathway between A and B. Remember that, about it not being a straight line? Mm-hmm. And we see that with Joseph, right? That and oftentimes for us, like, do you remember what you'd said in Sunday school? He gives him the promise.
Right, so at the very beginning of his life, he gets these dreams about stars and sheaves of wheat. Yeah. He's not given a dream about being in jail. Or that it's, he's sold into slavery at, you figure maybe he's 17 years old. Well, it says that he was 17, but, it's 30 years. He's 30 years old when he starts working for Pharaoh, so that's a long time, having had an initial vision of the future, but you're not getting filled in any of the gaps in between.
And it's amazing how, and it was really cool when you were talking about that in Sunday school there, that it was like, yeah, he gives us this end piece, but none of the grief in between to get us to that point, and how much that is for us too. So he does adapt in the shaving, he does adapt in order for him to retain his position. That doesn't seem...
Well, and at that point, he doesn't really have a position yet.
Yeah.
Because he's very respectful to Pharaoh here, and when he first has these dreams as a kid, he doesn't say, God gave me these dreams and helped me interpret them. But when it comes to jail, he says, God gives interpretations. And when it comes to Pharaoh, he points to God first. He says, God can interpret this. And then he gives Pharaoh advice to find discerning and wise men to put in charge of Egypt because of this famine that is coming. But he doesn't offer to do the job. He doesn't say, ooh, pick me. He leaves it all on the table there, and, in the way of serving and trusting that, maybe something will come of this, but he doesn't necessarily know it at that point, but he doesn't.
He really respects the authority of the king in making the decision.
Yeah.
There's not a self-promotion. And maybe that's why, going back to the deceit part too, the part of that deceit stuff with Jacob was pursuing his own agenda at the cost or whatever, right? To deceive your way into that. And Joseph is so different that even at that moment where the pursuit of his own agenda would be most beneficial, he doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Okay. See, I knew you guys would be more than 5 minutes. Given this nature and character, how do you think they would advise the king? Okay, so what skills or priorities would they bring to the governing of the kingdom? You may probably have referenced them a bit here, but Elliot.
Let's see here. Well, so the advice that he gives to Pharaoh is to make preparations for the famine that is coming. And I found that it's pretty shrewd for Joseph here. He asks that a fifth or 20% gets put away, but the famine is supposed to last for 7 years, but there's 7 years of good years. So he doesn't ask to put 1/7 away, he asks for a fifth. So it's
for more.
He asks for more. So there's 7 good years coming, and 7 years bad ones, but in each of the 7, he asks to put away 20%. So, 20% of anything is a lot. And it's an abundant year, so they could probably afford to do that. But it's also an accounting for anything to go wrong. Like, you're not trying to plan this out perfectly. So 1/7 from 1 year is going to equal what you need in another bad year. So there's some forward ahead planning buffering there and then another thing that I was interested in, so Pharaoh gives him a new name at this point, and it's called Zaphananeth Paneah, and I couldn't find any reference in my Bible for that, so I asked Tony for his commentary, and it sounds like there are some some translations. It's a couple of them, but one means food for life, food of the living, food of life, he who feeds the world, he who feeds the living, or savior of the world.
Wow.
So in this, there's this picture of the whole story of Joseph is an, prelude to Christ coming, but that a foreign king gives him this title of
Wow.
really respectful title after all this. So
That's pretty cool. I did not know the 1/5. McKinley, any skills or things that they brought to that kingdom?
Well, we really only see Esther advise the king like one time. It's really just the please don't kill the Jews thing. But she probably didn't do it a lot just based on what it doesn't talk about any other times, but based on what we know about like what women did in that time, she probably wasn't like going to the king a lot and being like, hey, I think you should do this. It was probably more of those quiet, like subtle mentionings, which was one of that was a skill, her gentleness and her ability to kind of do that and almost kind of manipulate the king a little bit. That was not in a bad way, but like that would have been how she likely would have advised the king. And then also Mordecai too, because he was end up being placed in such a high position, and her relationship with him, she could have done some of the same things with him, and then he would have done the more direct advising to the king. In
some of those subtle ways, so in her, what did her background and the what was going to happen to the Jews, how do you think that impacted some of those subtle maneuverings that she was doing? I don't know the nice word for it. I won't call it manipulating. We'll just call it maneuvering, directing, quietly. Where do you think she would make the emphasis in that? Just guess, like this speculative. Any thoughts?
I think she probably got the idea from Vashti and realized that being like bullheaded and strong was not going to work with this king.
Yeah.
And so in order to survive and to maintain her position, she had to kind of do the workarounds and do the banquets and the nice things, and while they were in bed, and like those kind of like the behind the scenes things would have just been necessary. And because she, like, I imagine, based on what we know about history, that this was like not uncommon for all women.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't just in the highest levels that the women kind of had to work in the background. It would have been like in their houses too. And she would have known that. She probably would have been being raised to be a wife at some point. And so she would have known that this is kind of the way that the world works. And that's kind of the way that she has to do it.
Logan.
So same thing with Nehemiah. There wasn't too many times where he actually advised him as the cupbearer, but I took the opportunity here to talk a little bit about the relationship that the king and him had. And so, as I said earlier, the friendship allowed for unbiased conversation between them. Artaxerxes trusted him with his life, and Nehemiah trusted God fully. So that's kind of a nice combination. Artaxerxes entrusted Nehemiah to rebuild the city because he lived a life with an identity of humility, integrity, work ethic, wisdom, and respect. And I think that's kind of key. He sent Nehemiah to go rebuild something that his nation had torn down. And he did it with, his resources. But he knew that Nehemiah wasn't going to go there and rebel against the kingdom because he respected the kingdom. So, it's that was kind of what came out to me in that one.
That's quite a show of trust.
Yeah.
To really send him into a space where he could really get a rebellion going.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and some of the other governors in the area tried to use that as a way of getting him in trouble. Well, look, this is going so well for Nehemiah. He's going to rebel against you. And the king knew all the time that he was respectful to the kingdom.
There was enough history between the two of them. Darren.
Yeah, so Daniel, he just had that kind of top shelf wisdom and intelligence, and along with the ability to interpret dreams and to speculate. I feel like Daniel was that guy that's just good at everything and kind of annoyingly always right. And despite people maybe not like being jealous or whatever, he just continued to be consistent. He had the strong moral compass. He had the wisdom. He had the answers. Just time and time again, what any of those 4 kings, he just gave them the correct answer.
Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions. Was there a time they faced a clash between obeying God and the king, and how did they respond? So was there a time, and if there wasn't, that's fine, but was there a time when there was a clash between, that they had to make a decision between obeying God and obeying the king? Elliot.
I think the obvious one for this that is in the story is Potiphar's wife and Joseph, where he has to run away and instead of giving in to the temptation for that. But down the road, Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife. She's the daughter of a priest, would have been to the sun god Ra. And it doesn't tell us anything about it, but somehow he's able to maintain this marriage and not lose sight of God. But there has to have been conflicting stuff in there somewhere.
Well, it have to, because that would be against the Jewish law, actually, when you think about it.
There would be so many things in there that would be hard to reconcile or not reconcile. But yet, later on when his brothers come, Joseph, he doesn't eat with the other Egyptian people, he eats by himself. So he's, we get a signal that he has still kept himself for God in the midst of all this.
Yeah.
And it's possible too that, he's been this trustworthy so far, he would have presumably been an influence in the family that way as well, because his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, they become,
2 of the tribes.
2 of the tribes, yeah. So somehow out of all that stays intact, but that can't have been easy having your father-in-law be one of the priests of Ra. So.
Interesting Christmas lunches.
Yes.
McKinley.
I lost my train of thought because I was thinking in my head and then I was listening and I'm also like not really awake.
See, that's why I have this.
Well, aren't you smart? I forgot my phone at home, so clearly.
Do you want us to move on, and if you think of it coming back?
I think I got it.
Okay.
I have notes. I think it was just like when obeying God would have been meant going against like what the custom was and like what she could have died when she went to the king if he didn't extend his scepter, and then also going against like a very high-ranking official in Haman. Like there isn't as direct of like God says you should do this, the king says you should do this, because, and they're opposites because like God isn't mentioned, and he's just kind of implied, and because the king didn't say you should go do this thing that's bad. It was like she was like my existence kind of goes against something that your high-ranking official wants, I guess. So
she really went against, and Haman at that time was in the place of being the most power, and so she really went against his most trusted advisor.
Yeah, and against the culture more than like against the king specifically, because he seemed to kind of pretty chill about it, actually.
Yeah. Logan.
Same thing here. There wasn't very many times where he was in conflict with necessarily the king, but more with the governors of the area, and they were trying to accuse him of rebelling or trying to cut him down for what he was doing. And what I definitely noticed, every time he was challenged, he always prayed about it. He always went to God with it, and then he would felt what the right way was going forward from that. So like I said, there were that time where they thought he was going to rebel. The king knew that that wasn't going to be the case.
Yeah, and it's not like we have instant. They didn't have the technology to know instantly what was going on in that further kingdom. Like he would probably hear about it pretty quick, but it would probably be fully engaged in rebellion by the time he heard. Darren.
Yeah, so with Daniel, out of chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den, kind of that classic story. So these guys under Daniel trick the king into making this law where they can only worship the king. And then immediately after that law, Daniel goes and prays. They catch him praying, gets thrown into the lion's den. But it just kind of highlights to me that Daniel very clearly fears the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
He does not fear man. And so when he has a crisis, kind of like what Logan was saying, straight to God.
Mm-hmm.
Let's pray. Let's figure this out. Maybe he asks for wisdom or mercy or whatever it is. But step number 1, go to God.
Is there kind of any final comments? You got 2 minutes each. Any final comments, thoughts, things that you learned? Whatever, Elliot.
I was just struck by the patience of Joseph through this whole thing of, not knowing where the end is necessarily going to take you, but staying trusting in the meantime. And Proverbs 22 verse 29 says, "Do you see a man skilled and experienced in his work? And he'll serve before kings and not obscure men." So,
what was that passage again, Elliot?
Proverbs 22 verse 29. So,
okay, McKinley, any last comments?
I was pretty struck by her, the gentleness. I feel like usually when I read Esther, it's all about the she was so strong, she went against the king, or Haman. And I just kind of, reading this time, kind of noticed how gentle she had to be in all of it.
Logan.
Okay, so I actually had quite a bit here.
Okay, we'll do. Why don't we do Darren first? We'll do his, and then you can close us off, Logan. We'll do it that way, unless you're long-winded too.
No, I'll stick to the highlight reel here. When I was reading Daniel, I was just thinking, you know how you say this guy's playing chess and we're just playing checkers? That's kind of how I feel it is with God in this whole situation. His sovereignty just jumped out at me, his power and his ability, and how it always is consistent with his nature as well. So not only is he powerful beyond all measure and sovereign and omniscient and whatever else, but he's good. And so that's an encouragement that I took from this. Kind of along with that, you look at Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God calls and God equips. And so that's kind of an encouragement and a challenge, I would say, because God certainly is more than capable and qualified to do whatever it is that he has called us to be a part of. The challenge is we really have no excuse to do everything that we're able to in taking advantages of the opportunities that he's given us. Because we know that he's not going to set us up for failure, even if it's difficult short term. His perspective isn't short term, and so just whatever God has called us to and equipped us for, let's go for it and encourage each other along in whatever it is, and he's going to accomplish his plan in the end.
Sweet. You almost preaching there. A little bit. Logan.
So when I was kind of going through this, and Tony had sent me a text kind of talking about, how are these guys salt and light in their situations. And I mean, this what I kind of summed up as kind of all 4 of these characters for sure. To me, the biggest thing for Nehemiah in particular was that he was a leader through action. He respected the kingdom. He prayed. He had absolute faith in God, and so he was a leader through action rather than words or fancy language. The king, adored him because he respected the king. There was a relationship there. I mean, for the king to even ask him why the long face, knew that there was something deeper there, right? He likely got to his position because of his actions. He led with hope, love, faith, and most importantly, prayer. Tony talked about how this relates to being salt and light in the post-Christian world. Nehemiah didn't call out any of the other governors on their beliefs or on their ways of life. He led his own group of people, empowered them and inspired them with his daily acts of faith and prayer. All others around him noticed him for his actions and his word, noticed him for his actions, not so much what he was saying. Mm-hmm. And when he did call people out, it was his own people who were collecting interest from the fellow Jews. When I compare this to us, I feel like Nehemiah is a perfect model for us as Christians, especially in these polarizing times on social media and special interest groups. We need to be beacons of hope and know that though that sometimes seems impossible to complete the task, we press on knowing it's God's plan. We need to pray daily that God would reveal his plan to us and that we need to act on that plan. And we need to spread love, a love that's so strong that it empowers and inspires people to want what we have. We need to establish an identity that's based on love, hope, and faith, humility, integrity, so that people trust us and open doors for us to have conversations of why we choose that identity. But recognizing that the important thing that creates that identity is our actions and not so much our words. We need to have the faith that even though we may go through obstacles like he did, God is with us and his plan will prevail.
You know what? I'm just going to close in prayer, and we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much, Gwen. I kind of figured that this was what was going to happen, and I'm thankful it did. So, Lord, I'd like to thank you for these characters who had so much to teach us. And just thank you for your word, for the honesty of it as we walk through difficulties and troubles and trials, but good stuff too. And thank you for the wisdom that you gave each four of these characters. And as they studied these lives, and as they go down the road, that you would remind them of what they learned from Joseph, from Esther, from Nehemiah, and from Daniel, to be people who you've called and have a plan for. Amen. Amen.